So the battle for France will be fierce, says France's new socialist mayor, warning Paris will be at the heart of the resistance against this alliance of the right, which seeks to take away what we hold most precious and fragile, the simple joy of living together. Emmanuel Gregoire, as the left retain the control of Paris and France's other two largest cities, and a blow to the far right ahead of presidential elections due here in a year's time. The far right sees 2027 as its best chance yet to seize power, and although they won several medium-sized enclaves in the south, they failed to capture any major prizes despite the predictions. Well, let's hear first of all then from Emmanuel Gregoire, the victor there, and his right-wing opponent as well, Rachida Dati.
I am thinking of the most vulnerable, of those who are this very evening sleeping on the streets of Paris, of the children who are suffering. I am thinking of all the most vulnerable who have needed the left since 2001 and who we will continue to support and protect as best we can. In any case, let me tell you, our joy is immense.
Our ambitions for Paris were strong. We wanted real change. Our campaign was full of conviction and determination, but this momentum was not enough. I was unable to convince enough people that change was not only possible, but necessary. I was also the victim of deceitful insults and attacks. Blows that are unacceptable in a democracy.
Rachida Dati and Emmanuel Gregoire there. Well, let's talk now then to lecturer in liberal arts at Queen Mary University of London, Andrew Smith. Andrew, great to have you with us for your analysis as ever here on France 24. I mean, the Socialists winning here in Paris then, in the end, a pretty good night for them, and they held on, didn't they? The key point is to the three main French cities.
Yeah, I think there'll be jubilation amongst the socialist camp around this victory in Paris. Of course, things started to look a little bit dicey, I think, between the first and second round. You know, we saw the centrist candidate merge his list with Rachida Dati. We saw the far-right candidate, Sarah Knafo, step back. And that all seemed to be the kind of mood music was that this was strengthening Dati's hand in some ways. But she's very much a Marmite candidate. People really did not warm to her. There was a lot of other kind of problems around it. And actually, I think this was all to the benefit of Emmanuel Gregoire, who ruled out an alliance with the far left, who stuck to his guns. You know, he didn't kind of get one of these technical mergers behind the scenes or anything like that. He campaigned on his own merits, on his record, working with Anne Hidalgo. And it all seems very positive. It'll be a memorable image of last night as well, of him riding to the results on his bicycle, and really seems to symbolise something in Paris. But I think, importantly, there'll be a bitter morning coffee in the Élysée Palace this morning, because there was, of course, all of the rumours that Emmanuel Macron, the president, had in some ways either sort of tried to kind of put in some calls in support of Dati, whether he was just sort of pulling in that direction or whether he'd be actively engaged. He denied it. He said he'd got better things to do. But nonetheless, I think for the socialists, this is a fantastic victory and a really important one that strengthens their ambitions and really clarifies their strategy ahead of elections to come.
Let's talk about the far right now, Andrew. I mean, here in Paris, of course, they're sort of nowhere, but across the country, they were really hoping for a good showing, weren't they, ahead of the presidentials in a year's time. Let's hear from the president of the far right, Jordan Bardella, putting a brave face on it, as they didn't do as well as predicted.
This evening is one of victory and hope. National Rally has achieved its biggest breakthrough in history tonight. In Marseille, National Rally and its allies have established themselves as the leading opposition force, now the only bulwark against the far left. Following this vote, National Rally and its allies have never counted so many elected representatives in France.
Yeah, as I say, putting rather a brave face on it. I mean, OK, they did very well, but not as well as predicted. Crucially, didn't take Marseille.
Yeah, I think that's a really significant moment. That Marseille result, I think, is one that people will be talking about for a while. It was one of their key targets, and in a number of their key targets, they were beaten back. And I think this contrasts some of the language we often see in the media about almost the inevitability of the far right dominating And we know they've dominated in the polls, the presidential polls. A lot of that's about anger with the status quo. A lot of that's also about clarity around who the candidate will be and the idea that they represent an alternative in that sense. But I think one of the things we've seen with the results last night is that, if anything, this is maybe a structural problem, but it's not a cyclical problem. This is not the time of the far right. But it does show us actually that they have made inroads. You know, they've got a whole bunch of those kind of small towns. They've built up some kind of results that they'll be quite pleased with in many ways. But places like Marseille, places like Toulon, places like Lens, of course, in the first round, they expected to make some inroads. These were big disappointments for them. Now, you know, the places like, of course, Carcassonne, you know, a big place down south, which has been for a long time really shifted away from that idea of the far right, except at a very low municipal level. But places like Nice as well, and that's a really important one, of course, with Eric Ciotti. Of course, he's not of the Rassemblement National, but he's obviously led that charge, that rally towards a unified right towards the far right. So Ciotti will be pleased, but that's not the Rassemblement National banner. Bardella will be pleased with some of the inroads in establishing a local presence. But I think the overall tone is that actually there are viable alternatives. There is no inevitability about this election. And actually where they've made those inroads is often in smaller places, often where turnout has been weak. And I think that is one of the biggest variables that we'll still see. Turnout was not overwhelming. It was not boom time in terms of people dropping those ballots in the ballot box. It is still a need to mobilize to get out. And actually what we've seen this last election last night, the results have shown us, is that many of those traditional parties, the centre-left, the centre-right, still have life in them, still have the ability to kind of mobilise and campaign on their own right and not to make concessions to the extremes. And actually, if they make those offers clearly, if they're honest about what they're presenting, then they can meet the public where they are and they can offer viable alternatives to the status quo. So there's a lot to learn, and I think the campaign strategists will already be crunching numbers, looking at candidates, and trying to work out how those primaries are going to run in anticipation of 2027.
Yeah, let's hear from Eric Ciotti. You mentioned him there, Andrew. Of course, he was, as you say, with the right-wing party. He's moved, separated from them, moved further far right. Let's hear what he had to say about his win in Nice.
Nice does not belong to one person, one clan, or one system. Nice belongs to the people of Nice. We have shown our capacity to bring together, to create unions beyond party politics.
Eric Ciotti talking there again, extolling the virtues, I suppose, of him and his slightly moving to the right. Where does this leave everything then, Andrew, for the presidentials? I mean, as you say earlier on, we've long heard here in France, everything's moving to the far right. The far left were doing quite well as well. But this seems to have funneled everything back to a certain extent towards the more centrist parties, doesn't it?
Well, one of the really challenging things is, I think, as Ciotti's victory showed, that was about name recognition, about a personal campaign, and about kind of belonging in the area. Christian Estrosi, his one-time mentor, then rival, desperate, bitter rival, had kind of cleaved much closer to the Macronist centre, had tried to run a campaign reaching out to the left, had tried and show himself to be a kind of, you know, an umbrella and something for everyone. He was sort of disowned, really, by the National Party, by Bruno Retailleau and the Republicans, and they refused to kind of speak up for him in favour of Ciotti. But what that maybe shows is nothing about the kind of the centre-right needing to do one thing or another, or the far-right needing to do one. I think what it shows is the importance of clarity of candidate, clarity of message, and of trying to meet people on the ground where they are. One of the things that the big loss for last night, if anything, was that neologism, that new word which crept in the first round of the technical fusion, the technical merger. This idea that these backroom deals were being done between, for example, La France Insoumise, France Unbowed, and the Socialist Party. That was an unsuccessful strategy where we saw it take place. In the story, we have to say, in places like Paris and indeed in Marseille, was that actually where the left stood on its own 2 feet, then actually it stood and it won. And already this morning, we've seen people, all across the left saying, well, one of the big problems we have, the lesson in this election, is Jean-Luc Mélenchon was the problem. That's what actually kind of holds back that fusion of the left and that broader idea of what's going on. I don't think he's going anywhere for 2027, so that's going to continue to be a problem. On the right and the centre-right, people like Valérie Pécresse, of course, a former presidential candidate, have said, well, what they need is a unified candidate. What they need is clarity, someone to express what the right wing actually is. At the moment, the right wing is a rainbow in France, and it's really difficult to try and unify what we're actually talking about. People don't know what actually anybody represents in that broad spectrum. And so the need is for more clarity. Already, people like Gérald Darmanin have called for that, for one candidate. But we know already there's going to be a number. We know that Edouard Philippe will run. We know Bruno Retailleau will run. Will they put themselves in a primary and try to kind of draw themselves? That's going to be the big challenge. Edouard Philippe, of course, strengthened by last night's result in Le Havre. He's done well. He will put himself forward for 2027. There is some kind of comfort, I think, for the centre. Even people like Gabriel Attal is able to say that, that left centre Macronist middle still has a role to play, perhaps supporting someone else. There is, I think, there's space in the kind of the mainstream of French politics, and it does not belong to the extremes. I think the more people talk up ideas of abstention, the more people talk up anger and emotion, the more people talk up the extremes of politics. That's where the danger lies, because that pushes people towards extremes away from the ballot box. If people can construct a useful vision which articulates political values, I think the lesson of last night is that there is an election there to be won. However, candidates need to declare soon, and there'll be lots of people working on the lessons of last night very, very strongly over the months to come.
Yeah, all to follow in the next year. Andrew will be following it, I'm sure. We'll be following it is here on France 24 as well. Andrew, good to have you with us as ever. Andrew Smith joining us from Queen Mary University of London.